Our son Max was about this tall, and I can see him in his granddad's lap with an old camera, tinkering around. It was broken, so he had opened it up, and he put paper like a film roll in, the old cameras, and he was just exploring, wrapped up in this. What is this? And by playing, he learned and explored and was open to the wonder of what there is and what there is to explore. Going a few years later then, when I was in seminary, I was all curious and exploring about Scripture, and I arrived with a faith from youth group that I'd learned and all, and then we took on the Old Testament, Genesis, and I learned and found out, okay, God did not write the Bible, Genesis. Okay, so who wrote it? Moses wrote it. It's in German, we call them first book of Moses, second, third, fourth, and fifth book of Moses. But then Moses died at the end of Deuteronomy. So how could Moses have written about his own death? Didn't work out so well. So in the learning process, I figured out and learned that the whole entire books of Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy were written by 4 different authors, and they wove them together, and that's how it became our current scripture. So from my initial faith and limited understanding, it opened a new world for me. But it also was a little bit unsettling, because it was like, okay, what I trusted, what I knew, what I thought was exactly as it is, kind of gave way to a broader and a wider and a deeper understanding. Now, our scripture readings invite us to look deeper, and not just from a historical, scientific understanding, but deeper also from a perspective of meaning. I personally believe deeply in science. I tell you what, when I have an ailment or something going on, I want to go to a doctor who went to medical school, who knows the science of bugs, of everything that it takes. Science works. Look at your phone book. I also believe in the scriptures, but not as a substitute for science. It's not like it happened exactly that way as it's written down, but the wisdom, the truth is in the story as we explore it. For example, did the disciples, were they really in the boat? And did Jesus come to them? Did that happen just exactly like Matthew wrote it down? Or does this story hold the wisdom and the truth that when we feel like the storms, when we feel like sinking, when we cannot hold life together anymore because we're overwhelmed, it's becoming too much, that we trust and know based on this scripture and experience it personally, that Jesus comes to us in our need. Jesus comes to us in our needs when we feel like the ground is giving in, it's not solid anymore. So the scripture readings and the stories, just like children and youth and adults, were to explore them and learn more about them. Now, generally I think of Jesus, He had it all together. He knew everything. But today's scripture reading is one of those occasions where I think Jesus learned too. The human side of Jesus, he learned in this encounter with the Canaanite woman or Syrophoenician woman whose daughter was hurting. Now, if your baby is hurting, you are hurting. So she comes, she's desperate. She just needs help. So she comes to Jesus. Let's call her Susie. So Susie comes to Jesus, her baby daughter is hurting. And she comes to Jesus, and Jesus is not saying anything. It's almost like he's overlooking her. He's like, what's going on there? Then the woman doesn't stop. So she goes to his disciples. Then his disciples, I think sometimes they were like bodyguards. Like you remember the story where they tried to keep the children away from Jesus? So they tried to give him space. So the disciples, the bodyguards, come to Jesus and tell him, send her away. Just get rid of her. She doesn't give up. She comes back to Jesus and pleads, help me, help me. And then Jesus compares her to a dog, to dogs. That's a big thing. He says, the food of the children, we don't give it to the dogs. But there is something in her that switches. And she says, yes, but they're scraps. They're scraps. She's longing for healing. She doesn't give up. And it seems almost like in that moment, something shifts in Jesus and he learns from her that she's worthy because she didn't give up. She's worthy of healing, of wholeness, of help, like all the other people. And then Jesus praises her faith. And that is in comparison to Peter, the story we heard about last Sunday, where he says, "Ye of little faith." Peter, you had little faith because you were sinking. You didn't trust when you walked on water. So here Jesus lifts her up as a person, a woman of faith. So if even Jesus learns and didn't have it all together, how much more do we have to learn and be open and be curious? Sometimes that learning means unlearning. We grow up and we learn and we become set in our ways, but then at some point it's time for us to review what we thought, what we lived by, what we thought the world was like. And Richard Rohr, one of the mystics, spiritual writers, says it's almost like we grow up in a world and order and structure it. We learn it. Just this is how the world is. Then at some point, it gets shifted around. We end up in disorder or disorganized. Things, ways we thought life is, don't function anymore. And then we get in reorder. We get reorganized. Or he also talks about the second naivete. Like as children, it's this innocent worldview, everything is okay. Then something gets broken. And then getting reconnected with a new and wider understanding. So the question is, what understanding, What conviction, what belief that you held for the entirety of your life is worthy to be rethought, re-experienced, or maybe even set aside? For as one of my mentors said, we all walk in shoes that are too small for us. We're invited into a larger life, into a wider understanding. Now, in nature, that happens automatically. We all know of animals that shed, like snakes. Their skin gets too tight, they're growing, so what do? They shed and grow into a bigger body. Same for crabs. Their exoskeleton gets too tight, they're growing beyond it, so they break out of it and grow a new one. Same with caterpillars, they even transform some of them into moths and butterflies. So there is a natural process in nature where animals seem to transform and open up and shed into a bigger world. What conviction, what beliefs did you outlive? And are you curious enough and courageous enough to open and explore what is beyond those beliefs, your convictions that you always held to be true? Even Jesus learned and lived into the wider reality. He learned from this Canaanite woman. How much more are we to learn? So what belief, what conviction you held dear and close to you, you lived with it, is worthy to revisit, re-examine, and maybe even let go in order to grow into a larger life.